What we're going to be talking about is benchmarking the application's development and maintenance environment. And benchmarking this environment can potentially provide significant insights into the performance of an organisation's IT processes and help them identify how and where they could be most effectively improved. However, many organisations, in our experience, because we've been working in this industry now for 20 years, they initiate a benchmarking activity, but they do it without first fully determining what the objective of the benchmark is and the benefits that they hope to achieve. The critical thing that they fail to do is to actually establish the criteria by which the projects will be selected and compared. So they jump into a benchmarking activity without fully planning it before they start. So this presentation discusses the reasons why organisations choose to benchmark. It helps identify the potential benefits that benchmarking will be able to provide them, but it highlights the pitfalls of failing to appropriately plan. And we talk about terms of reference, establishing the terms of reference for benchmarking before you start. And this terms of reference provides a rigour into the benchmarking process and helps ensure its success. So this is a guidelines to successful benchmarking based on these terms of reference. Now, when we're talking about benchmarking, there's a host of definitions of what constitutes a benchmark. And common to all of these definitions is the concept that benchmarking is about evaluating the current performance of your organisation's products, services and work processes and comparing this performance to those of perhaps the industry leaders and or your peers in the industry in order to identify the performance gaps and develop a continuous improvement program. So benchmarking is about knowing where you're currently positioned, how you compare to your peers or to industry, and using that knowledge then to improve your internal processes. Now, when we're talking about benchmarking, there's two different types, and we're going to go into these two different types. Internal benchmarking essentially is about comparing internal projects and not going externally. Externally benchmarking is about comparing against industry. But whichever type of benchmarking is selected, internal or external, the benchmarking concepts we're going to be talking about remain the same. It's really only the source of data that changes. So, why benchmark? Benchmarking is important in that it provides objective information to answer important questions, but only if it's done properly. Therefore, before we rely on the answers it gives us, we need to ensure that the benchmarking approach that we've used is valid and that we get the appropriate return on investment of our benchmarking activity. Benchmarking involves the measurement and comparison of the performance outcomes from selected IT processes, and we typically use it for the purpose of establishing a degree of improvement, establishing our competitive position, and or to provide input into our management decision making. And whilst many organisations routinely collect their costs for their software projects, that's an essential, they collect the effort of their staff involved in the project. Some organisations collect the defects that are actually identified during the software development process, and fewer organisations actually measure the functional size of how big each one of their projects are. Whilst they will collect this as just routine, they rarely go that extra step of turning that raw data into information and use that information to actually facilitate change. So benchmarking is the activity that turns data into information by measuring the current practices, comparing current performance to past performance or peer performance, and then interpreting the results. Usually organisations start by focusing on internal benchmarking to target areas for improvement before comparing themselves to external business units or the wider industry. However, that's not always the case. It's often the results of an industry comparison where organisations have identified the high cost of their IT processes that motivates the management to rethink their application development and maintenance strategy and start doing some internal measurement. As a result of a benchmark report, management may choose to reduce costs by outsourcing their IT development and support, or alternatively targeting internal processes for improvement. And benchmarking enables organisations to assess their performance against their competitors, evaluate the benefits and cost savings of investing in new tools and technologies and techniques. And so that tends to be the reasons why organisations benchmark, is to make some of those important strategic decisions about the future of their IT. But benchmarking is not all easy sailing. There are risks. And what this presentation is going to highlight is where those risks can lie and how do you go about mitigating them to ensure that when you do benchmark, that the information that you get is accurate and it does provide valid input into your decision making. For example, benchmarking has been used a lot recently in client-supplier contracts, and clients have put into these contracts a requirement that the supplier performs perhaps to industry best practice levels. Alternatively, they may identify what their performance is internally prior to outsourcing and then make the supplier guarantee that they will do year-on-year improvements, and they will arbitrarily pick a number like 10% that the supplier has to improve, or alternatively the supplier may have to improve compared to industry. Based on, often when the contract gets to the point of renewal, they will have the supplier benchmark to ensure that they've actually satisfied the requirements, or alternatively there may be bonuses and penalties put into the contract that if they don't actually perform as they're required to, that they pay a penalty, or alternatively if they perform better they get a bonus. So you can see there is often a lot of money tied up around a benchmark, and it is extremely important prior to them getting to the end of the contract that they actually establish the guidelines and the terms of reference for that benchmark before they start. We've seen contracts worth billions of dollars get cancelled due to an inappropriate benchmark. So if you're an organisation that's putting these sort of performance metrics into your contracts, I'd recommend that you have a look at some of these terms of reference to ensure that they're actually in the contract. So what do I mean when I'm talking about a rigorous terms of reference? Well, we're going to go through each one of these points in turn, but essentially we're going to have a look at the strategic intent of the benchmark. How will the results be used? And that has to be agreed from the start so that everybody knows how the outcome of the benchmark is actually going to be used in the decision making. You need to establish the type of benchmark. Is it internal or external? You need to establish the benchmark performance metrics. What processes or products are required to be assessed to satisfy the goal of the benchmark, and how will they be measured? You need to establish the standards for measures. What are the agreed units of measurement? What sort of data accuracy is required? And what are the validation requirements on the data? You need to establish the scope of the benchmark. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for projects and applications within the benchmarking set? You need to establish the frequency of the benchmark. When and how often should the measures be collected and reported? If you're going to benchmark and benchmark against something else, you need to establish who those benchmarking peers are. What criteria will the equivalent sample set of data be selected for comparison? You need to agree on the benchmarking report before you start. Who's the audience? What will be the report structure, content, level of detail provided to support the results? And critically, you need to determine the dispute resolution process. So prior to a